The grand chamber of the Kylothian ascendancy was not designed for silence, yet silence was the only tyrant that dared to rule it now. Built from the hollowed-out obsidian of a dead moon and suspended in the gravitational embrace of a gas giant, the chamber was a monument to 10,000 cycles of unbroken conquest. The walls were lined with the banners of subjugated star systems, tattered fabrics of civilizations that had knelt before the Kylothian war machine, their histories erased or rewritten to serve the glory of the ascendancy. Usually this hall thrummed with the guttural chants of victory, the clashing of ceremonial armor, and the holographic projections of burning fleets. Today, however, the air was thick, stagnant, and suffocatingly quiet. High Warlord Vrax sat upon the throne of cinders, his massive, chitinous hands gripping the armrest with enough force to fracture the ancient stone. His breathing was a low, wet rasp that echoed in the stillness, a sound that betrayed the biological stress of a predator that had suddenly found itself in a cage it could not see, let alone break. Around him, the Council of War, generals, admirals, and star strategists who had never known defeat stood in a semicircle of humiliation. They avoided looking at the center of the room where a massive holographic emitter displayed the impossible. It was a frozen recording, a looped moment in time that had shattered their understanding of physics, war, and superiority. It showed the pride of the Kylothian fleet, a devastating armada that had glassed planets and extinguished suns, simply stopping. Not destroyed, not outmaneuvered, just stopped. In the recording, the Terran vessel, a sleek, unassuming geometric shape that defied the aggressive aesthetics of galactic warships, sat motionless against the backdrop of the nebula. The Kylothian kinetic rounds, capable of piercing planetary crusts, hung suspended in space halfway to their target. The plasma lances, usually blinding streams of destruction, had dissipated into harmless mist upon touching an invisible boundary. The human ship had not fired a single shot. It had merely existed, and in its existence it had imposed a new law upon reality. Violence was no longer permitted here. Vrax shifted his weight, the heavy plates of his ceremonial armor scraping against the throne, a sound that made the younger tacticians flinch. He looked at General Kale, the commander who had led the assault and returned not with a trophy, but with a message. Kale was a warrior of 3 centuries, his carapace scarred by the claws of beasts and the lasers of resistance fighters, yet he looked small now, diminished by the memory of what he had witnessed. The questions that hung in the air were not about tactics or logistics, but about the fundamental nature of their existence. If the Kylothians were the apex predators of the galaxy, the unstoppable force of evolution, then what was the thing that had looked at their armada and told it to sit down like an obedient pet? The silence stretched, becoming a physical weight, pressing against their chests, until Vrax finally spoke, his voice a deep tectonic rumble that vibrated through the floor. He demanded to know the status of the diplomatic channel, though the word diplomacy tasted like ash in his mouth. To a Kylothian, diplomacy was the beguiling whisper of the weak before they were crushed. It was not a tool for the strong. Yet the human transmission had been clear. They were coming to talk. They were coming to the heart of the ascendancy, to the very room where the death warrants of species were signed, not to surrender, but to explain. The sheer audacity of it made Vrax's blood boil, but the image of his frozen missiles, hanging impotent in the void, cooled his rage into a cold, calculating fear. He signaled the sensor officer, a tremor in his hand that he hoped went unnoticed. The officer, whose face was pale beneath his dark exoskeleton, reported that the human vessel, the same one that had humiliated their fleet, had just exited subspace. It had bypassed their outer defense grid not by stealth, but by simply moving through it as if the mines and automated turrets recognized a master. There were no alarms. The automated systems had not fired. It was as if the machine spirits of the Kylothian defense network had bowed in reverence. Holographic display shifted, showing the live feed from the external sensors of the station. The human ship, which the logs identified as the Silent Arbiter, materialized from the warp. It did not tear through reality with the violent, ripping thunder of a Kylothian drive. It slid into existence like a diver slipping into water without a splash. It was vast, larger than the sensor ghosts had initially indicated, a smooth, silver ovoid that reflected the swirling storms of the gas giant below. It had no visible engines, no weapon ports, no bridge towers. It was a perfect, seamless object, an artifact of Matham. Attical purity that offended the jagged, industrial sensibilities of the Kylothian eye. Beside the colossal dreadnoughts of the ascendancy, which bristled with cannons and missile racks, the human ship looked like a sculpture placed among sledgehammers. But the Council knew better now. They knew that the smooth surface hid capabilities that made their antimatter warheads look like stone spears. As the ship approached the docking spire, the station's gravity stabilizers groaned, compensating for the immense mass of the newcomer, yet the ship moved with the grace of a leaf on the wind. Vrax watched the approach, his multiple eyes narrowing. He had assembled his honor guard, the Crimson Reavers, warriors who had never failed to kill their target. They lined the walls of the chamber, their energy pikes humming with lethal intent. It was a trap, of course. Even if they could not destroy the ship, Vrax reasoned that the crew must be mortal. If the humans stepped onto this station, they would be soft, fleshy, and vulnerable. He would take their leaders hostage, force them to deactivate their godlike shields, and then he would dissect their technology until the shame of the nebula was washed away in blood. It was a desperate plan, a primitive plan, but Vrax was a creature of war, and he had no other tools. The airlock cycle began. The heavy blast doors at the far end of the grand chamber groaned, the hydraulic locks disengaging with a series of loud, metallic thuds that echoed like cannon fire. Steam hissed from the pressure valves, obscuring the entrance in a thick white fog. The council held its breath. The Crimson Reavers tensed, their muscles coiling, ready to spring at the first sign of aggression. Vrax leaned forward, his hand drifting to the plasma caster at his hip. What would emerge? A towering cybernetic war form? A telepathic horror? A legion of armored shock troopers? The fog swirled, disturbed by movement, and footsteps echoed on the metal grating. They were not the heavy, rhythmic stomps of armored boots, but the rhythmic, measured click of hard-soled shoes. The mist parted, and 3 figures walked into the grand chamber of the Kylothian ascendancy. The silence deepened, transforming from tension into bewildered confusion. They were small, painfully, ridiculously small. They wore no armor. They carried no weapons. They were draped in simple, dark fabric that tailored to their bipedal forms, adorned only by small silver pins on their lapels. The figure in the center, a male of the species with graying fur on his head and skin the color of weathered bronze, walked with a relaxed, almost casual gait. He did not look like a conqueror. He did not look like a warrior. He looked like an academic, a scholar one might find in the dusty archives of a conquered library. To his left and right walked 2 others, a female and another male, both carrying sleek, flat devices that they held with the ease of familiar tools. They did not flinch at the sight of the 10-foot-tall Kylothian guards. They did not pause to admire the skulls of leviathans mounting the walls. They walked straight toward the throne of cinders, stopping exactly 10 paces away, a distance that demonstrated neither fear nor aggression, but a precise, calculated courtesy. Vrax rose from his throne, towering over the humans. He was nearly double their height, a monstrosity of muscle and chitin, and he let out a low growl designed to trigger the primal flight response in any prey species. The humans did not flinch. The leader looked up, meeting Vrax's multifaceted gaze with 2 small, dark eyes that held a terrifying depth of calmness. There was no defiance in that look, only a serene, absolute confidence that unsettled Vrax more than any weapon could have. "I am High Warlord Vrax, Scourge of the 7 Sectors, Breaker of the Titan Gates," Vrax boomed, his voice amplified by the acoustics of the chamber. "You stand in the heart of the Ascendancy. You have halted our fleet. You have insulted our honor. Explain yourself, creature, before I peel the flesh from your bones to see what makes you so arrogant." The translation matrix barked the words in the human tongue, harsh and guttural. The human leader adjusted his cuffs, a gesture of mundane civility that felt like a slap in the face in this context. He cleared his throat, a soft sound that cut through the warlord's posturing. "Greetings, High Warlord," the human said, his voice soft, melodic, and perfectly modulated. "I am Ambassador Elias Thorn of the Terran Coalition. We apologize for the interruption of your military maneuvers. We found it necessary to intervene before you made a mistake that could not be corrected." The sheer condescension of the statement, referring to the attempted genocide of a solar system as a mistake, stunned the council. A murmur of rage rippled through the room. General Kale stepped forward, his pride unable to take the insult. "Mistake," Kale hissed. "We were expanding our domain, as is the right of the strong. You used cowardly trickery to freeze our weapons. You do not fight like warriors, you fight like ghosts. Face us with steel and fire, and we will show you the error of your interference." Ambassador Thorn turned to look at Kale, his expression shifting to one of mild pity. "Steel and fire," Thorn repeated, as if tasting the words. "We moved past steel and fire a long time ago, General. We found them to be inefficient." He turned back to Vrax. "We are not here to fight you, High Warlord. If we wished to fight you, this conversation would not be taking place. Your fleet would not have been stopped. It would have been unmade. We are here because the Kylothian ascendancy has reached a threshold. You have grown loud. Your expansion is creating noise in the quiet dark, and noise attracts attention. Vrax narrowed his eyes. This was not the plea for mercy he had expected. We do not fear attention, Vrax snarled. We are the storm that clears the galaxy of the weak. Who are you to tell us when to stop? A species that hides behind invisible walls? Thorn sighed, a very human sound of weariness. Tapped the flat device in his hand, and a holographic projection sprang to life in the air between them. It was not a map of the Kylothian Empire, but a map of the galaxy and beyond. It showed the spiraling arms of the Milky Way and then zoomed out to the local cluster. It showed darkness, vast, encroaching darkness. You call yourselves the strong, Thorn said, his voice taking on a harder edge, stripping away the diplomatic veneer to reveal the steel beneath. You pride yourselves on conquest. But you are children playing with matches in a library made of dry paper. You believe the galaxy is a hunting ground. We know it is a life raft. The metaphor was lost on many of the Kylothians, but the tone was not. Thorn stepped closer, violating the personal space of the High Warlord, a crime punishable by death, yet the Crimson Reavers stood frozen, their instincts screaming that to strike this small creature would be like striking a neutron star. Let us discuss the incident at the Uit perimeter, Thorn continued. Your sensors told you that your weapons failed. They did not fail. We simply changed the local cosmological constant of that sector for a duration of 6 minutes. We increased the drag coefficient of the vacuum. We dampened the excitation of high-energy particles. We turned the space around your ships into molasses. It was a localized edit of the laws of physics. The Council stared in blank horror. To edit physics, to rewrite the fundamental rules of the universe as a tactical maneuver, it was heresy. It was impossible. You lie, Vrax whispered, though his hearts were hammering against his ribs. No being can command the stars themselves. Thorn smiled, a sad, thin smile. We do not command them, we understand them. Humanity spent 10,000 years not conquering others, but conquering ourselves. We spent millennia in silence, watching, learning, building. We learned that the energy required to destroy a planet is trivial. The energy required to save one, to hold a civilization back from the brink of its own stupidity, is immense. That is the power we cultivate. We are not warriors, Vrax. We are gardeners, and you are trampling the flower beds. The silence that followed was absolute. The Kylothians were a species that measured power in tonnage, in yield, in body count. The concept of power as restraint, of control over the fabric of reality used to prevent violence, was alien to them. It was terrifying. If what this human said was true, then the Kylothian armada was nothing more than a collection of toys. Vrax felt the foundation of his empire crumbling beneath his feet. If they could turn off weapons with a thought, could they turn off stars? Could they turn off hearts? Why? Vrax asked, his voice losing its thunder, replaced by the raw rasp of a creature facing its obsolescence. If you are gods, why let us exist? Why let us conquer the Drath? Why let us burn the systems of the Outer Rim? Why stop us only now? Thorn's expression softened. Because until now you were only hurting each other. Tragic, yes, but the galaxy is resilient. Civilizations rise and fall. But your recent trajectory, your push toward the Theta Rift. That is different. You were about to wake something up. You were about to breach a barrier that was placed there for a reason. Thorn gestured to the hologram. The image zoomed into a sector of space the Kylothians had marked for their next crusade. It was a region of dense, dark matter, a navigational hazard they intended to clear with graviton bombs. The Theta Rift is not a natural formation, Thorn explained. It is a cage. The atmosphere in the room shifted from humiliation to a cold dread. The Kylothian myths spoke of the old dark, the time before the stars burned bright, but they were just stories. Thorn was making them real. Manatee serves as the shield, the ambassador said. We watch the cages, we reinforce the bars. When a species becomes advanced enough or loud enough to threaten the integrity of these cages, we intervene. Usually we guide them subtly. We influence their politics, shift their research. But you Kylothians are stubborn. You move too fast. You break too many things. You left us no choice but to reveal ourselves. Vrax looked at the hologram, then at the small human. What is in the cage? He asked. Thorn didn't answer immediately. He looked at his two companions, who nodded slightly. Then he turned back to the warlord. A hunger, Thorn said. A civilization that did not learn restraint. A species that consumed its own galaxy and came here looking for more. We defeated them barely 60,000 years ago. We trapped the remnants in the gravity well of the Theta Rift and wove the fabric of spacetime around them to keep them frozen. Your graviton bombs would have shattered that seal. The revelation hung heavy in the air. The Kylothians had been proud of their wars, thinking they were the protagonists of the galactic history. Now they realized they were merely noisy children playing on the lid of a coffin that held a monster. The humiliation of the stopped fleet vanished. replaced by a sudden, vertigo-inducing realization of scale. They were small, so incredibly small. Vrax sank back into his throne, the armor that usually made him feel invincible now feeling like a heavy, suffocating shell. "So," Vrax said, his voice weary, "you are here to demand our surrender, to dismantle our fleets so we do not break your cage." Thorn shook his head. "No, we are here to offer you a job." The unexpectedness of the statement caused a ripple of confusion among the generals. "A job?" Kale blurted out. "We are the Kylothian Ascendancy, we do not serve." Thorn's eyes flashed with a sudden intensity. "You will serve or you will perish, not by our hands but by the thing you almost woke up. We cannot watch every cage alone. The galaxy is too vast and humanity is tired. We have stood vigil for eons. We need a species that understands war. We need a species that is strong, disciplined, and fearless. But we need that species to be directed." Thorn walked closer to the throne, his presence now dominating the room despite his size. "We do not want to disarm you, High Warlord. We want to upgrade you. Your kinetic weapons are crude, but your spirit is formidable. Your ships are fragile, but your courage is absolute. We can give you shields that do not break. We can give you drives that do not tear the sky. We can teach you the physics of the quiet, the mathematics of the wall, but in exchange, you must stop conquering the weak. You must turn your weapons outward toward the dark and stand with us on the wall." The offer was staggering. It was a complete paradigm shift, to go from being the conquerors of the galaxy to being its guardians, to be given the technology of the gods, but to be bound by their ethics. Vrax looked at his generals. He saw the hunger in their eyes, not for land, but for the power Thorn described. The promise of shields that do not break was a siren song to a warrior race, but it meant submission. It meant admitting that there was a power greater than the Ascendancy. Vrax looked at the hologram of the Theta Rift, the swirling darkness that hid the ancient enemy. He realized then that the war he had been fighting his whole life was a skirmish. The real war, the war for survival, was waiting in the dark. "Show us," Vrax said, his voice low. "Prove to us that this threat is real. Prove to us that you are not just tricking us into servitude." Thorn nodded. "Fair enough." He tapped his device again. "Captain, lower the veil." The command was spoken into the air, directed at the ship orbiting outside. Through the massive viewports of the grand chamber, the stars seemed to ripple. The human ship, the silent arbiter, pulsed with a deep violet light. Suddenly, the view of the galaxy changed. The darkness of space was stripped away, revealed to be a curtain. Behind the curtain, the Kylothians saw the currents of the universe. They saw the ley lines of gravity, the flows of dark energy, and they saw the scars. Terrible, jagged scars in the fabric of reality surrounding the Theta Rift. And pressing against those scars, visible only with the human sensors sharing the data, were shapes. Massive, writhing shapes of shadow and hunger, clawing at the walls of their prison. They were not ships. They were biological entities the size of star systems, dormant but dreaming, their psychic screams visible as distortions in the ether. The council recoiled. Some of the weaker minds in the room vomited or fainted. The sheer scale of the horror was beyond comprehension. These were the things the humans had fought. These were the things the humans had caged. "That," Thorn said, pointing to the horrors, "is the enemy, T. They do not want your planets. They want your biomass. They want to drink the entropy of your stars. We have held them back, but the cage is weakening. We need the Ascendancy. We need your fleets to form the second line of defense. We will provide the technology to reinforce the seal, but if they breach, we need someone to hold the line while we prepare the reset." The word reset sent a chill through Vrax. He didn't ask what it meant. He didn't want to know. The reality of the situation settled over him like a shroud. The petty squabbles over territory, the mining rights, the subjugation of lesser species, it all seemed so pointless now. "The Ascendancy," Vrax began, his voice trembling, then firming up. "The Ascendancy respects strength. You have shown strength beyond measure. You have humiliated us, but you have also opened our eyes." He stood up, towering to his full height, but this time not to intimidate. He slammed his fist against his chest, the salute of a warrior to a superior commander. "We will not be your pets, human, but we will be your shield brothers. If this darkness comes, it will find the Kylothian fleets waiting." Thorn smiled, and this time it was a genuine, warm smile. "That is all we ask, High Warlord. Now let us discuss the upgrades to your fleet. We have much work to do, and the gauge on the cage is dropping." The tension in the room broke, replaced by a flurry of activity. For the first time in history, the Kylothian High Command did not plan an invasion. They planned a defense. The humans moved among them, no longer seen as weak prey, but as elder wizards sharing forbidden knowledge. The cultural clash was immediate and jarring. The Kylothians wanted to mount the new shield generators on the front of their ships for ramming. The humans insisted on spherical coverage for omnidirectional defense. The Kylothians wanted to weaponize the zero-point energy drives. The humans patiently explained that doing so would unravel the local spacetime and kill everyone instantly. It was a friction of philosophies, the hammer meeting the scalpel, but it was productive. Days turned into weeks within the station. The Epic's End, the sister ship to the Silent Arbiter, arrived with engineers and fabricators. The Kylothian shipyards were transformed. The jagged, brutalist aesthetics of the Vraxian fleet began to merge with the smooth, geometric designs of the Terrans. It was a terrifying hybrid. Massive dreadnoughts that still looked like predatory beasts, but now hummed with the silent, deadly power of human tech. Vrax watched the retrofitting from his observation deck, a strange feeling in his chest. Hope, purpose. For centuries, his people had fought because it was all they knew. Now they were fighting for existence itself. He found himself spending hours with Thorn discussing not just tactics, but philosophy. He learned of Earth, a world of blue water and green hills, so different from the harsh, volcanic rock of Kyloth. He learned of the human history of war, how they had almost destroyed themselves a dozen times before the Great Awakening. The moment they realized that survival required cooperation, not dominance. It was a lesson the Kylothians were learning late, but perhaps not too late. However, the universe does not wait for readiness. The transition was interrupted 3 months into the Alliance. The sensors deep within the Theta Rift, sensors that had been silent for millennia, screamed. A fracture had appeared in the seal, not a full breach but a leak. Something had slipped through. The alarm klaxons blared through the station, a sound that usually signaled the start of a hunt, but now signaled the start of a desperate defense. Thorn burst into the war room, his usual calm replaced by a focused urgency. "It's a scout," Thorn announced, his fingers flying across a holographic interface. "One of the lesser entities, it squeezed through a microfissure. It's heading for the binary star system of Proxima Centauri V, your border territories." Vrax looked at the display. The entity was moving at impossible speeds, a streak of void-black negation against the stars. "My fleet is not ready," Vrax growled. "The upgrades are only 40% complete." "They have to be enough," Thorn said grimly. "If that scout feeds, it will send a signal back to the main host. It will tell them the meat is fresh and the cage is brittle. We have to kill it before it consumes a star." The fleet launched. It was a ragtag armada of half-upgraded Kylothian destroyers led by the Silent Arbiter and the Epic's End. They intercepted the scout in the deep void between systems. The entity was terrifying to behold. It was not a ship, but a biological horror the size of a moon, a writhing mass of tentacles and eyes that shone with a malevolent, violet light. It emitted a psychic scream that tore at the sanity of the Kylothian crews. Men clawed at their helmets, bleeding from their ears. Vrax, on the bridge of his flagship, the Worldbreaker, roared over the comms, rallying his men. "Focus! Pain is an illusion. The Ascendancy does not kneel to nightmares." The battle was chaotic. The Kylothian weapons, enhanced by human tech, fired beams of coherent light that burned into the entity's flesh, boiling away tons of biomass. But the creature regenerated instantly, its wounds knitting together with sickening speed. It lashed out with tendrils of dark energy, slicing through the hulls of the escort frigates as if they were paper. "It adapts," General Kale screamed over the channel. "Our weapons are feeding it energy." "Switch to resonance frequencies," Thorn's voice cut through the panic. "Don't burn it, destabilize it, use the new emitters." Vrax barked the order. The Kylothian ships shifted their fire. Instead of plasma, they fired waves of gravitational distortion. The creature shrieked, a sound that was felt in the bone marrow rather than heard. Its form began to waver, losing cohesion. "It's working," Vrax yelled. "Pour everything into the emitters," but the creature was intelligent. Realizing the danger, it focused its attention on the source of the coordination, the human ships. It ignored the Kylothian fleet and surged toward the Silent Arbiter, its massive maw opening to swallow the vessel whole. The human ships' shields flared, glowing white-hot as they held back the physical assault of the moon-sized monster. "They cannot hold," Kale shouted. "The mass is too great." Vrax made a decision. It was a decision that went against every instinct of self-preservation, every doctrine of Kylothian warfare. But it was the decision of a guardian. "All ships," Vrax bellowed. "Ramming speed, target the creature's center mass, drive it away from the humans." The Kylothian fleet, usually the masters of self-serving conquest, dove into the jaws of death. They swarmed the entity, firing point-blank, their hulls scraping against the eldritch flesh. The Worldbreaker slammed into the creature's flank, its prow buried deep in the black ichor. Vrax laughed, a manic, joyous sound. "Is this the best the old dark has?" he roared. "I have eaten breakfast harder than you." The distraction worked. The creature recoiled, thrashing to dislodge the biting flies. This gave the Silent Arbiter the second it needed. Charging the singularity lance, Thorn reported. Clear the blast zone. Pull back, Vrax ordered. The Kylothian ships reversed thrusters, tearing themselves free from the monster. A beam of pure, absolute darkness shot from the human ship. It wasn't a laser, it was a linear black hole, a tear in reality that consumed everything in its path. It struck the creature dead center. The entity didn't explode, it imploded. It was folded in on itself, crunched into a point of infinite density, and then vanished, leaving only a shockwave of hard radiation. Silence returned to the void. The Kylothian fleet floated in the debris, battered, leaking atmosphere, but alive. Vrax slumped in his command chair, purple blood dripping from a wound on his forehead. He looked at the view screen. The silent arbiter hung there, undamaged, a silver sentinel. Target destroyed, Thorn's voice came over the comms, sounding exhausted. Signal prevented, the cage remained sealed. Vrax let out a breath he didn't know he was holding. You fight well for gardeners, Vrax grunted. And you fight well for vandals, Thorn replied, and Vrax could hear the smile in his voice. The fleet limped back to the station, but the mood had changed. There was no shame in the damage this time, there was pride. They had faced a demon and lived. They had fought alongside the humans, not as subjects, but as allies. In the aftermath, the alliance was formalized. The Treaty of the Rift was signed not on paper, but in the exchange of codes and blood. The Kylothian ascendancy transformed. They were still a martial culture, they still valued strength, but the definition of strength had changed. Strength was no longer about how many planets you could conquer, but how many you could protect. The human warship that had stopped them became a symbol, not of defeat, but of awakening. Years later, Vrax stood on the observation deck of the Sentinel, a massive fortress station built at the edge of the Theta Rift. Beside him stood an older Elias Thorn. They watched the swirling darkness of the rift, the cage that held the end of all things. The Kylothian fleet, now a sleek, terrifying armada of hybrid technology, patrolled the perimeter, their sensors sweeping the dark. They are waking up, you know, Thorn said softly. The tremors are getting more frequent. Vrax nodded, his hand resting on the hilt of a sword that had been forged from the hull of a destroyed enemy scout. Let them wake, Vrax said, his voice deep and steady. We are not the same children we were. We have learned the silence. We have learned the wall. He looked at the human, the small, fragile creature that had stopped an empire with a word, and we are no longer alone. The camera of history pulls back, leaving the two figures silhouetted against the backdrop of the cosmic storm. The galaxy spins on, oblivious to the monsters in the basement and the guardians at the gate. The humans had brought the shield and the aliens had brought the sword. Together they stood on the ramparts of existence, ready for the long night. The lesson had been learned. Dominating the galaxy was easy. Saving it? That was the work of titans. And as the first ripple of the next great wave surged from the rift, the combined fleet of the Terran-Kylothian alliance powered up their drives, a million lights igniting in the dark, a defiant declaration that here, in this corner of the universe, the line was drawn. The story of conquest had ended. The story of survival had just begun. The silence of the void was no longer empty, it was waiting. And so were they.